don't think the administration should be afraid of a partial deal. Now, it needs to be the right deal. It needs to include structural components, things like forced technology transfer or intellectual property. Larry Kudlow was talking late last week about looking at changes in China's investment caps, and maybe you could get structural stuff on agriculture. So it needs to include those structural components. But if in exchange for that, all the U.S. has to do is to say, I'm not going to escalate tariffs further, and maybe over time, if you implement some of this stuff, I'm going to roll back tariffs to $250 billion. I think that's a good deal. And I'm not afraid to say that. I think it's a way that the president can essentially have his cake and eat it, too. He can say, look, I made progress on some real significant things, but I'm still tougher than anyone else has ever been with $250 billion in tariffs in place, and I'm going to keep those in place until China comes around on the rest of the issues. So I think that is something they should take seriously.
Michael, should markets bank on this idea that China could come around on the rest of those issues longer term? And if so, if we do see some sort of at least pause in tariff increases right now, I mean, is that a realistic expectation?
Yeah, we've been telling investors they should be skeptical. So I think if you cut through the noise over the last couple of days, what we learned is that China is effectively coming to the table, at least it says it's coming to the table with more of the same that it's been coming with over the last year and a half. More agricultural purchases, some kind of formal recognition of regulatory changes it's made over intellectual property. And so then the question is, if they're offering more of the same, what incentives does the U.S. have to go ahead and accept that or sort of phrase that as a concession? Perhaps if the economic data were worse or if market performance were worse, then the payoffs to sort of taking a partial deal that looks like what China is offering might be greater. But to us, neither of those factors is meaningfully different. So we're pretty skeptical that you're going to get a pause this week. It's possible that, in the intervening period between now and the December 15th tariffs, that something could be arranged just because the data could worsen or the market could get weaker. But even so, unless one side or the other really starts blurring the red lines around the core issues, then we think that we're fated for more escalation.
The way you set it up as, the administration having the ability to essentially portray this partial deal that you mentioned, just simply don't initiate the next round of tariffs in exchange for some promises and some soybean purchases, et cetera. Does that actually stand up as a status quo for a long period of time? In other words, does that mean, is that a suitable goal for the administration to have these promises on some of the core issues, but not really change anything on the ground that's even going to touch the trade balance?
Well, it's difficult, and it depends what's in it. And I want to be clear that if it's just soybeans, I don't think it's a worthy deal. But on the other hand, if it includes some of these structural things, and then the U.S. Takes a pause and actually gives China a chance to prove that they're going to stick to their word on this, that isn't a bad thing for the United States. I think if the U.S. keeps tariffs at about $250 billion, that's the sweet spot. That's where China is clearly hurting more than the U.S. And so the U.S. has a chance to sort of allow China to try to implement these things, to take a pause, to provide a little more certainty in its markets while maintaining the pressure on China. And so, again, I go back to, I think that if the U.S. could do that, it could be a sustainable position. And the U.S. at the same time doesn't need to stop doing the other things that it's doing. The U.S. has legitimate concerns about what China is doing with its Uyghur population, with the surveillance state. And China can keep doing those kinds of things. The U.S. can keep addressing those kinds of things. I'm just saying a pause on the tariff hikes isn't a bad thing from the U.S. perspective.
But, Clete, I mean, if that's all true, and by the way, your Freudian slip right there was exactly right. The Chinese will continue to do those things that have already been characterized by state and commerce as national security risks. I'm not sure how a pause does anything other than elongate what we've already been in.
Well, I think we need to be realistic about the fact that we're not going to get the big deal, this week, this month, or probably this year. And so if the U.S. can bank progress and then stay aggressive on China in a whole bunch of other ways, I think that's a viable position. And I'm not saying the U.S. should back down. I'm just saying the U.S. does need to be realistic that at some point continuing to escalate the tariffs does have an economic toll. And if they can give a little bit of certainty to the marketplace and stay tough in China on a whole bunch of different other ways, work on this Uyghur issue, work with Senator Rubio on some of his ideas on how to deal with problems in China, I think that's a good place to be.